Señoras y señores, muy buenos días. Es un placer estar aquí hoy y tener la oportunidad de compartir mi experiencia en gestión del patrimonio. Mi español es muy básico, por lo que continuaré en inglés. So I'm going to talk a little bit mainly about Liverpool, one of the cities of England, the northwest of England, population about 500,000. The city and its surrounding area, the population for the region is about 2.4 million. The fifth largest city in the UK, about 350 kilometres from London. So very briefly, I will talk a bit about its history, about what went wrong in the place, about how the foundations were put into position for a more successful future, to look at different kinds of regeneration, big-scale regeneration, small-scale regeneration, look at some of the challenges we face, some of the mistakes that have been made, and many of the successes. I'll look briefly at some other examples in the UK, and then try and draw together some lessons that we've learnt and some reflections on my visit to Valparaiso. So just very briefly to explain, I work for Historic England. I'm the policy director. We're a government body, we're a government agency that look after heritage. We champion and protect the historic places. We help people understand, value and care for them, as Philip explained. So until 2 years ago we were called English Heritage. We've now split into two organisations. So our main role is to advise central government, but we also advise local government, businesses, communities, individuals. We work with school kids and a whole range of other partners. And we've been working in Liverpool for many years on a whole wide range of projects with all those different partners. So a little bit about the history of Liverpool. I'm sure many of you know quite a lot about it, but the city was founded in 1207. It's been a major port for several centuries. Particularly strong growth in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was heavily involved in the slave trade. As global expansion took place, it became a key port, particularly for the Americas. It played a very important role in the Industrial Revolution. And importantly, in England, it was close to many of the other cities that were the main manufacturing parts of the country. So amazingly, in the mid-1800s, there were times that actually Liverpool's wealth exceeded that of London. However, it didn't carry on like that forever. It was badly bombed in the Second World War, and it took a long time to overcome that. And as I'll show you later, there are still examples of buildings that haven't been restored since the Second World War. Looking more specifically at the dock area, during the 1970s, as deindustrialization took place, and many of the heavy industries shut down or moved elsewhere, the port traffic began to decline, and the city as a whole was suffering severe economic problems. This is Albert Dock, and Philip showed one or two pictures of that, and I'll be showing some more later. This was the dock right in the center of the city. So by the 1980s, the docks were virtually unused. Liverpool had many empty buildings, many industrial empty buildings. It was in decline. It had one of the highest unemployment rates in the UK, if not the highest. So it was, in many ways, seen by people to be a failing city, really. And it had a big image problem. I think people didn't want to invest. If you were wanting to invest in the country, you wouldn't have invested in Liverpool. The industry was declining, the buildings were seen to be in poor decay, there was a lot of political instability at the time, there were social problems in the area, and really, in many ways, the city became a byword, became thought of as a failing city. And even here on the statue of Admiral Nelson, one of the great naval heroes of the country, there in the background, is perhaps the fate of Liverpool if something hadn't been done. So, I think there's a whole series of steps that were taken. I've just mentioned a few here, but I think one of the lessons from Liverpool is it takes a generation, if not 2 generations, to really turn somewhere around. I've mentioned a few things here. There was a garden festival, International Garden Festival in 1984. They were beginning a number of government initiatives, central government initiatives, local government initiatives, beginning to invest in the city. There was a more stable political leadership that arrived in the early 2000s. They set up a 10-year program for developing infrastructure in the area, for improving the infrastructure. We, along with the City Council and a number of local partners, set up something called HELP, Historic Environment Liverpool Project. Many of you know the Beatles song Help, so it was named after that. And the idea there was to try and pull partners together to think about heritage as a focus for change. And actually one of the key partners there was the local paper, the local newspaper, which played a really important role. They were often critical of people like us, organisations like us, but having them on board, caring about the city, telling us when we made mistakes, telling central government when they made mistakes, criticising their own people sometimes, that was really important to have it in the news all the time, being talked about. And in 2004, it became a World Heritage Site. And a bit like Valparaiso, actually, the World Heritage Site is not huge. Compared to the whole of the city, only a small part of it is actually within the official boundary. But when people talk about it being a World Heritage Site, when I first came to Valparaiso, I knew it was a World Heritage Site. I thought of the whole city as being the World Heritage Site, not just the small area in the red line. In 2008, it was chosen to be the European Capital of Culture by the European Union. There was something set up called the Enterprise Zone, which gave some financial advantages to encourage people to invest in the city, which gave advantages over other cities elsewhere. Importantly, it set up an urban design strategy, because not only do you want growth, new jobs, new buildings, but you want to make sure that there's good quality as well. There was a strategic regeneration framework, I'll show you a picture in a second, devised in 2012, and will continue rolling on. And more recently, Liverpool Vision, which is the economic regeneration company, has been set up, and that now leads many of the big regeneration projects in the city. So this is just one picture from the regeneration framework. I won't talk about it in great detail, but really I think it's just to emphasize that there's different elements that put together a successful city. So here on the left-hand side, you can see the harbour area. To the north of the centre is the commercial core, and St George's area here. The cathedrals are in this area. A big retail development here, which I'll talk about. The waterfront, Albert Dock, in this area here. Creative industries in this area here, and the university and other knowledge institutions, a hospital as well, further out to the east. So in a way, the point of this diagram is showing how all these particular areas are linked together through planning frameworks, through design frameworks, and through conservation controls. One of the key things, I think, for many port cities is traditionally they were working cities, and therefore their waterfront was the workplace. Therefore, the public wouldn't go to the waterfront because that's where the work was done. The public might go to the parks, inland. And I think many cities, Valparaiso is clearly one, where you have this issue about the port land not often being publicly accessible, or the amount of access the public has to the waterfront is limited. And certainly Liverpool had that problem too. So the regeneration of Albert Dock was a really key turning point for the city. So in 1981, the Maritime Museum opened up in one of these former warehouses. And in 1988, perhaps the most important step was the arrival of the Tate Gallery in another warehouse, this one here that you can see on the right-hand side. The design was done by James Stirling, the internationally famous architect, and it now has more than 600,000 visitors a year. The Maritime Museum, in fact, has more visitors, 840,000 visitors a year. And particularly, I think that's an important one for school children and one of the reasons why it has large numbers of visits. And I think Tate Liverpool is probably one of the best examples we have in the country of culture as a driver for change. Moving a national art gallery, or part of the collection of a national art gallery, from the capital city out to a provincial city is a really big step. I think it sends a very important message about art not just being for the metropolitan elite. And I think it also started to make people who wouldn't normally have visited Liverpool, why would they go to Liverpool when they could visit lots of other attractive places? It gave them a reason to go to the city. So higher spending people who wouldn't normally go there would start to go to the city centre, they'd arrive there and find it an attractive place and enjoy their experience there. And I think one of the points, when I was doing the research for this talk, I found out there was actually a third museum that's relatively recently moved into this area. It's actually a museum to the Beatles, pop group The Beatles. As you know, one of our best exports to the world, one might argue. But incredibly important as a sort of brand image, you might say. And so this museum's opened, it's great news, it seems to be very successful. And when I looked who actually owns and runs the museum, it's the local transport company. Now this is a public sector company who runs the ferries across the Mersey, runs buses, local trains, all that kind of thing. And they've actually opened a museum about the Beatles in a historic warehouse. And I think my point there is every single organisation in the area can play a part in regenerating. And it's not always the obvious players doing the obvious things. So there's a whole load of variety of ways that you can bring about positive change. So here's another picture of the successful area. And one of the things that Historic England's been doing as a government agency is trying to understand better the economic and social impact of investing in heritage. We love heritage, it's our job, it's our daily lives. We live and breathe it. But we recognise that for many people, they don't see heritage as the most important things in their lives. So now I'm going to give you a few statistics here, and of course they come with a health warning, because you can't directly translate statistics of situations in the UK to those in Chile or any other country. But I'm giving them to you because I think they're helpful maybe to understand how bigger change, more positive change, can be brought about. And these are the kind of figures that we use when we're talking to central government and to local government to try and persuade them to continue to invest in the private sector, to continue to invest in heritage, and also when we talk to the private sector to remind them of the importance of investing in heritage and not destroying it to put something brand new in its place. So I really can't underestimate in the UK at the moment the importance of creative and cultural industries in the economic growth of the country. Now, what we've found in research in England is that creative and cultural industries are almost 1/3 more likely to be in a locally listed, in a protected building than in a non-protected building. And when you move to major cities, creative industries are more than 50% more likely to be located in a historic building. So I think this is a really interesting thing. I think it's partly about what gives people inspiration, what makes them come up with their new ideas. Of course, sometimes a white plain box is a good thing, but quite often interesting environments spark more creativity. We also looked at property values in and around heritage areas. What we found was that in locally protected areas, conservation areas as we call them, the average property price for an identical property is 9% higher inside a conservation area than one outside a conservation area. And even if you move just outside the protected area, the property prices are still higher. So people see there's a positive value in being associated with a historic area. They see the positive part of being there. And UNESCO did some work looking at the values in World Heritage Sites in the UK, and there they found there's a 27% increase in property values in and immediately around World Heritage Sites. So We sometimes are accused by developers that heritage is a drag, it prevents development from happening. But actually, some of the figures show the opposite, which is it drives growth. It makes a positive place that people want to invest in. Turning to tourism, what we found is for every dollar, pound, peso that a tourist might spend, a third of it is spent in the tourist site itself, but 2/3 of it is spent outside the tourist attraction. So the benefit, the majority of the benefit, arguably, goes to the wider area, not just to the heritage attraction itself. Hotels, shops, bars, transport, all those other things that you need to do in order to enjoy the heritage attraction. Looking at jobs, what we found is that half of the jobs created as a result of heritage are created inside the heritage attraction itself, but the other half happens to the wider economy. So in a sense, for every job that you create in a heritage attraction, another job will be created supporting that attraction in the widest sense. So again, it makes good economic sense. UNESCO's estimated that the economic benefit to the UK of our World Heritage Sites is around $100 million a year, a huge amount of income for the economy. Looking at the heritage sector as a whole in England, around 138,000 businesses are located in historic buildings. They generate 1.4 million jobs, and 5% of all employment is based in historic buildings, in protected historic buildings this is. So they're not these kind of museum pieces that are out there nice to look at, but playing no part in the economy other than being a nice visual backdrop and something that tourists might look at. They're a key part of the overall economy of an area. What we found in doing some research recently with some academics was that businesses located in protected buildings actually generate more gross value added than businesses located outside historic buildings. We found, or the consultants found, that on average, a business located in a protected building generated around $16,000 a year extra in value than an equivalent business located in a non-historic building. So again, there's something going on about the value of the businesses being located in historic buildings actually being somehow more dynamic. So that's the end of the statistics, you'll be pleased to know. So what I'm going to do now is just run through a few examples about regeneration. And at the beginning, you probably remember I talked a bit about big scale macro regeneration and micro regeneration, because I think you need all kinds of regeneration. It's not one solution solves all the problems. So as I said earlier on, Liverpool really suffered in so many ways in the 80s, 70s, 80s through the 90s. And in retail ranking terms, the kind of competitive element between cities in the UK, because they're all quite close to each other, if you don't like the shopping in one city, you can drive to the next city an hour or two away and shop there. So there's a very competitive element to how retail takes place in the country. And Liverpool had dropped from 4th place to 17th place in the UK retail rankings. So a private developer took on this site here. You can see the sort of whitish new development happening there. There's the Albert Dock behind us there. You can see some port activity going on here. And this is the city centre, the main current retail core in here. They set up this new big regeneration redevelopment scheme, clearing away some redundant buildings, principally non-historic areas, but there were some sacrifices. We had to lose a few historic buildings along the way. They've created 150,000 metres squared of retail and leisure floor space, created new homes, a small new park, 5,000 permanent jobs after the construction, and also really helped to link the traditional city centre, the retail centre, through to the docks at the top of that picture. So Liverpool One, as this development's called, has helped to regenerate the whole of that area, and I think it, again, was another way of drawing people into the city who might otherwise have gone and visited other places. So, not everybody likes the development. Architecturally, it's won some architectural awards, but it is a really big scale development. And I know there's a retail development being proposed here. They are difficult to integrate into a city centre, but I think this one's done it reasonably successfully. And I think it's really helped to bring Liverpool up for another group of visitors who may not care that much about heritage, but when they come shopping, they might enjoy the heritage at the same time, and that's fine by us. So the next example I'm going to talk about, another big scale thing, is Stanley Dock. So whereas Albert Dock, which was right next to the city centre, and in regeneration terms had a really good location, right on the waterfront and squashed between the waterfront and the city centre, Stanley Dock, on the other hand, was a little bit further north, out of the city centre, and had many more problems. In 2012, it was described as the biggest adaptive reuse challenge in Europe, so quite a difficult thing to overcome. So just a bit for people who love heritage, so a bit on the left-hand side is the 1840s warehouse, a bit on the right-hand side is the 1910, I think it was 1905, 1901 warehouse. So those were the two key elements in the dock, both protected to a very high degree. So yes, the first dock, 1848, formerly a tobacco warehouse, started in 1848, then expanded in 1855 and further again in 1901. All within the World Heritage Site. During the Second World War, they suffered bomb damage. These buildings have been empty for more than 30 years, out of the city centre, as I say, not really a very attractive location. And we, English Heritage, as was now Historic England, were very concerned about these buildings. We really didn't think that anybody would be mad enough to take them on. But finally, someone did. Again, private developers. I imagine there was probably some public money, but very limited these days. And from 2013 onwards, the developers have turned this building on one side of the dock into a hotel, events venue, and now on the other side of the dock, the 1901 building, they're converting that into 583 apartments. Now, it took quite a lot of bravery, I think, for the developers to do that, because they developed the hotel, and when you looked out of the windows of the hotel, you looked straight across the dock into a ruined building that had been empty for more than 30 years. Who would pay money to go and stay in a hotel like that? So I think they had staying power, and I think they saw in the long term it was a good investment. And I think to their credit, we were involved in advising in some minor ways, but actually to the credit of the developers, what they've done is a very high quality scheme with a limited budget. The detailing of it is good, it feels strong, industrial, it's not kind of changed the character, it's working with the grain, as we say, rather than against the grain. And there's an interior shot reusing those really fantastic spaces. And going to the Naval Dockyard here yesterday, seeing some of the conservation work that had gone on there, and fascinating buildings, great potential in these industrial buildings, when the time's right, if they go out of naval use, to kind of reuse these things. There's a lot of potential in them, there's a lot of character in these buildings. So anyway, a successful scheme, we hope, recently finished, and so far so good. So the next example I'm going to talk about is a development called Liverpool Waters. And the story here is a bit more worrying, if I'm honest. Now, this is a huge mixed-use scheme, again, in this area between the two docks I've just been talking about. So on the city centre is just on this right-hand side here. Stanley Dock is in here somewhere. And the city centre is behind this area generally. So the developers, private developers, own the land, came to the city council and said, we want to spend $6.6 billion US to regenerate this area. Now, if I was a city councillor, that's quite a tempting offer. In a city that's still struggling, despite all this good news that's been happening, that's a huge investment. They owned 60 hectares of land. They wanted to develop that slowly over a 30-year period. 23,000 apartments, 17,000 jobs, 2 million square metres of commercial floor space. So huge development, would transform the character of the city, a lot of it along the waterfront. And the City Council had a real dilemma. So there you go. So this, just to explain, so here are the buildings that, the three graces as they're called. The Liver building, the sort of key building in the city centre, the iconic building in the city centre. This is the main commercial area behind here. And this area in here and this area up here is the new development area, and there's Stanley Docks in here somewhere. So the World Heritage Site includes these buildings here. It then sort of comes around the back of these proposed new buildings. So this is not built, this is proposed, this is proposed. So you can see it would extend the city centre and would, in the terms of the developers, create huge amount of jobs and investment. Now, it would have a very significant impact on the World Heritage Site. It would transform the skyline of Liverpool, and that's one of the things that we were very concerned about. And indeed, UNESCO were concerned about in terms of World Heritage Site designation. Currently, the World Heritage Site on Liverpool is on the in danger list. There is a real possibility that the World Heritage Site may be de-designated in Liverpool. We have opposed this development. We, Historic England, have opposed it. The City Council listened to our arguments, but were not persuaded. And sorry, not just us that opposed it, many other people did too. The negotiations are still ongoing, but the outline permission, the general permission, has been granted. And now the developers are moving forward to try and plan how they create all those jobs, all that floor space. We will continue to work with the developers, as with the City Council and heritage groups, to try and make sure that that development, as it evolves, is as sympathetic as it can be. But in some ways, some of the character of Liverpool will have been lost, I think. And I think in a way, trying to be fair to the City Council, they have a dilemma. They have an economy they need to continue to develop. They need jobs for the people. It's still a deprived area relative to much of the rest of the country. And they had a difficult choice, balancing heritage and development. So hopefully, the City Council says it's committed to trying to make the development happen as sympathetically as possible. UNESCO and ourselves and others will try and hold them to that and make sure that it is as successful as it can be. So as well as these big regeneration projects, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the small ones, micro-regeneration as I call it, because you can't, in my view, just turn a city around by 3 or 4 really big developments. It's also block by block, building by building, tackling the quality and the general environment and doing it in that way. And in some ways that's much more complex, because if you just deal with the big developers, you've just got 3 or 4 people to talk to. If you're talking about smaller areas, particularly residential areas or small commercial areas, then there's a whole host of people who own these, live in them, rent them, whatever it might be. So the area I'm going to talk about here is called the rope walks. So it's called the rope walks because it was in the 18th, mainly 19th century, it was the area where they used to make the ropes that would then be on the ships that used to sail to Valparaiso and other places. So they have long straight streets because that's how you needed to make ropes, in long straight lines, obviously. And clearly, as the need for ropes declined in the 20th century, as the port trade declined, then this area started to go into great decay. It's got many protected buildings in the area and really was run down and in a poor condition. And just here's an example here. As you can see, these are probably, they look like probably mid-19th century buildings, but many empty buildings, and then kind of optimism coming soon, this says, optimism for the future, but some of these hoardings, some of these signs, adverts have been up for many years. So vacant sites of a type that you don't really see very often in many other cities in the country. So just a couple of examples here of the building by building approach. I'm sorry, it's a very dark picture, but on the left-hand side is the interior of a historic chapel. It had been disused for a long time, and a controversial scheme actually with many people to convert a chapel, a church, into a restaurant. They kept the altar where it was, and they have tables quite close to the altar, and you can sit within the church and drink a beer or a glass of wine, whatever. But I think my view is, in a place like Liverpool, you have very little choice, actually. The alternative was probably to let the building fall down. There's been a lot of social investment in Liverpool. There are lots of community facilities that already exist. And although it might be the best use, the ideal use, if it's not going to be a church, to turn it into a community use, if there are already many existing community uses, then it's just going to make another one less viable. So some difficult choices that the City Council and ourselves had to make. And the second example here is just a typical building you might find in Liverpool of a few years ago. Again, empty, very low values. The landlord may live in London rather than in the local area, hoping that the value of the land might increase, but hoping for a very long time. So the characteristics of the Rope Walks area was very, very mixed. And I think it had a number of warehouses, houses that were turned into commercial spaces. But what it did have actually was a very vibrant kind of mix of uses. In some ways it's a lot like the central bit of Valparaiso, very mixed in character. It did actually also have a big, long-established Chinese community. And here's the Chinese Arch, I think the biggest Chinese arch in Europe, I believe. And there's been a whole series of efforts. So there have been grant programs that we and other organisations have put in money, the City Council's put in money. But I think a lot of it is actually about creating an image for the city, for this part of the city, in a way giving it a brand, giving it some kind of special identity, and making it somewhere that people find interesting and attractive to go to. And there were one or two developers, I mentioned one here, Urban Splash, they're called, who were quite bold in going in to take on some of these empty and derelict buildings, not just in Liverpool, but some of the other industrial cities of the north of England, and actually beginning to put in apartments. Initially the prices are very low, and now the apartment prices are increasing quite quickly. And those developers in this fairly small area invested around $120 million over the last 10 years. Now, some of the changes to the protected buildings, listed buildings as we call them in England, have been quite dramatic. And I think the compromises that you have to make sometimes in order to achieve successful regeneration are difficult. And in an ideal world, it would be great to put some more public money into these buildings and to keep them without that change. But the reality was, in the centre of Liverpool 10, 15 years ago, there were so many empty buildings, it would simply not be possible to put enough public money in to sort them all out. So I think it's about adapting the buildings for new uses, encouraging private investors to take the step to put their money in to bring about a brighter future. So here's just a couple of examples of successful regeneration. One industrial building and one former commercial and residential building. So my next example about the small scale end of things is what they call in Liverpool the bombed out church. So this was a church built in 1811, St Luke's, bombed in the Second World War, a ruin for all that period since the Second World War. Now, I looked on our register of problem buildings, we call it Heritage at Risk, and in Liverpool there are 9 churches and 1 synagogue that are at risk from being lost. They're in poor condition, they've got all sorts of problems. So it would not be realistic, I think, to expect anybody to put the roof back on this building because there are so many other buildings that need help as well. The cost would be huge. So a community group took on caring for this building and turned it into a cultural space. And we and the City Council together put in around $600,000 to stabilise the stonework. But really it's a kind of open space. It's partly a war memorial to the people that were killed in Liverpool and the people that fought in the war as well. But it's a sort of iconic sign of a new approach to heritage in the city, and that sometimes keeping bombed out churches are ruined is actually quite a good thing, because it's another dimension of telling the story of a city and how it's gone through many different changes. I actually looked at our list of problem buildings in the area in Liverpool, and what was really interesting was there's now only one building that is not a public building that's at risk. If you look at the list on other parts of the country, you'll see many residential buildings, buildings that have clear commercial uses on our list of problem sites. But I think partly the success of Liverpool has been that they have slowly tackled the buildings and tried to find new people to take on their problem buildings. Now, maybe today is not the best day to talk about football after last night, but I'm going to anyway, I'm afraid, because I can't change my PowerPoint. But the point I'm trying to make is there are many players in the regeneration game in how you change the image of a city. And Liverpool, many of you will have heard of Liverpool City. When I travel around the world, people come up and say Liverpool and Manchester to me, and they don't speak any English, but they know those two words. And Liverpool Football Club is in the Anfield area of the city. So this is kind of like the equivalent of some of the poorer suburbs of Valparaiso, some of the communities on the hill, you might say. So the houses around this area were poor, in poor condition. The prices where they were privately owned were very low. There were many vacant buildings. And for many years, the city council, government, and others have been trying to sort out the problem of what you do with these areas, because there was housing need, but poor condition of the existing housing. As I say here, the values of the properties here, a typical house here was worth 80% less than a property in London, so very low property values. And what happened here was the city council then went into a partnership with the football club. So I should just say, I'm sure you've guessed, that's the football ground there, and then these are the terraced houses here. They went into partnership with a housing association, a public-private housing body, to tackle the whole of the area, to improve the quality of the area. So not only to improve the housing, but also the public spaces, so you begin to create a more attractive environment for the people who live there, and also for potential investors, and hopefully improve the quality of life for the people who live there. So the football club, what they get out of it is they get an expanded stadium, paid for with their own money. There's a new public square, and there's a lot of new and refurbished housing. So some of the old housing was demolished. We were not particularly happy with that, but some of it we accepted could go. But a lot of refurbished historic houses, and again, everybody working quite hard to keep the community that was already living in this part of the city continuing to live there, rather than moving those people out and putting people from London in there or wherever it might be. So football-led regeneration. So my next example is another football example, which is how not to do it, and this is a Manchester United example. So Manchester City, not that far from Liverpool, and economically more buoyant. And interestingly, Gary Neville, some of you may have heard of him, former Man United player, former England player, now a property developer. And he may have been a very good footballer. I wouldn't like to comment on his property development skills. But he put forward a very controversial, him and his developer partners put forward a very controversial new development here. There's two towers on the left-hand side in the centre of Manchester. And there was a lot of argument. We felt that this was destroying the historic area very significantly. They would be very visible from a huge distance around, and in many ways were not at all appropriate. So we and others opposed this proposal. In the end, before the City Council finally made the decision, Gary Neville and his property developer friends actually withdrew the scheme. And what Gary Neville said, we don't often get footballers talking about heritage, we believe that in a city that aspires to be global, the best of old and the best of new can live together. However, we are going to make further refinements. So I think what he was saying was, okay guys, I can see I'm not going to get away with my two tall towers. I recognise I need to go away, think more about how I can fit new development into a historic city centre. So we have something to thank Gary Neville for. So that's the end of my Liverpool examples. I'm just very quickly going to talk through 2 or 3 other places where I think have relevant parallels. Bristol is perhaps our most colourful port city, or bits of it are anyway. And this transformed the city, transformed its old harbour area. Again, mainly driven by a large single developer, but also in the streets around, like these ones here. Small-scale developments, individual properties, or 8, 10 properties being developed at one time. So many of the original buildings in the area, 18th, 19th century historic buildings, but also the city had a very strong encouragement for good quality new design. And this modern buildings, stretch of buildings in the middle of that picture, so the ones on the top, 18th, early 19th century buildings, the one at the bottom near the harbour are a mixture of 18th, 19th and modern buildings. And the bit in the middle, completely new development. Now, this might upset some people who love heritage, but actually I think this is a real positive contribution to the city. I'm sure people who live in Valparaiso will enjoy these kind of colours, but for us in England who expect things to be grey, I think this is really exciting, and it's part about creating distinctive identity for a place. And certainly Valparaiso has that kind of distinctive identity. So my next example is Plymouth, another port city. This one's in the southwest of England again. This area here, almost on an island, but on a spit of land on the edge of the city, was a Royal Navy site built in 1830 to supply the food and the beer and all those things for the Navy ships that would then sail around the world. Was coming to the end of its productive life as for the Royal Navy. So they sold the land on to private developers, and it was a very rough area, typical port area, you might say, without going into too much detail. Lots of interesting characters lived in the area outside this particular the naval base, but quite a rough area. But what this did was bring in investment into the area. So again, homes, offices, leisure, hotels, retail, a whole kind of mix of different uses. Now, some of this involved the loss of 1 or 2 historic buildings just outside the site, and that's difficult to accept. But in overall terms, the price of those 1 or 2 small losses was worth it for the overall gain, and a very successful scheme, I think this one. Now, I thought when I talked about a prison example, you'd be surprised, but I know here actually in Valparaiso, you've already done it. You've already done good things with your prison. But when I talk to many other people from around the world, they're often quite surprised about the place that old prisons can play in regeneration. Oxford is a university city, many of you will know, and not a deprived city. But when the kind of 18th, 19th century prison fell out of use in 1996, it was bought up by some developers, and even though it failed to meet the standards for prisoners in 1986, it became a very desirable upmarket hotel for people to visit. Now, you do get a cell and a half, by the way. You have an ensuite bathroom, which I'm not sure the prisoners, actually their bathrooms probably were ensuite. But they did a lot of upgrading. But part of the attraction of the hotel is that you're staying in a prison. It's a different kind of experience. And increasingly in a globalized world, what people want is something different, something memorable. So people now pay a lot of money to stay in prison. It's good. There's also a much older part of the castle tower, so it's been a kind of protected area for 1,000 years or so, really. And the castle tower is now accessible to the public. It wasn't before because it was within the prison walls. So the public can go and now visit the historic tower and look over the city of Oxford. But the hotel has taken on, and there's new development as well around it. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the importance of local government in the whole regeneration picture. The City Council, in the case of Liverpool, was absolutely central to the whole thing. And without them, it wouldn't have happened. But understandably, heritage is not always their first agenda. It's housing, it's jobs, and I absolutely accept that. And what we did with Liverpool and other cities was identify what we call a heritage champion, somebody in the City Council who's an elected member, who cares particularly about heritage, and when there are discussions going on about other issues, we hope that person might stand up and say something about heritage. Don't forget heritage. And I think that if you have people within the city council that care about heritage, elected members as well as members of staff, then that gives a sense of continuity, and as the plans are developed, then that will continue even if there's a political change at some point in the future. A word about design, and these are my Liverpool examples, and I've shown you some really good examples of design in Liverpool. I think it is a problem in all cities in the UK. There's development pressure, and I think sometimes the standards of architectural design in Liverpool and elsewhere don't meet our expectations. These are a few relatively old examples. I'm not going to name the architects, but I think on the left-hand side, not a very sympathetic way to build next to a historic building, in my view. The next one along is a kind of fascinating example of how to extend. I'm not sure it works, but somebody had a go anyway, and maybe next time around that might disappear when it's the next refurbishment. Sometimes the junction between the old and the new is really not very comfortable. To the left-hand side, this is not the main elevation of a modern building, this is the side elevation of a modern building. But the way that it sits up against the historic building on the right-hand side, I think is really not very satisfactory. Some of it's not really been thought. It's like the design has been done in isolation of the context. And this church here in the centre of Liverpool, close to the docks we've just been talking about, the new buildings wrap around the church, come quite close to it. I'm not really sure. I don't find this particularly successful. But there are many examples in Liverpool that are good. I don't just want to say that bad things come from Liverpool. One of the things that Historic England's been doing in recent years is recognising that if you just tackle heritage, you're not even solving half of the problem. You're solving less than half of the problem, because it's actually the people that make things happen. So what we've done in London recently is a campaign called Keep It London, which is all about getting people who live in London to identify what is special to them about their city and what makes it the place they want to be in. So what we did was we created a very short film, a 3-4 minute film. You can go online and look at it, Keep It London. We took some portraits of residents, a whole range of different residents, kind of from bankers through to street sweepers, all kinds of people. We put an exhibition up. The exhibition went into the City Hall. Each of these people had their photograph taken and just talked a bit about the location of their photograph was how they identified themselves. They explained who they were and why this particular location they'd chosen was important to them as their image of the city, their part of the image of the city. We developed an app for smartphones, so you can take yourself on 6 different heritage walks around the city to explore different parts of its history and its very diverse history. Just very briefly, sometimes even the best architects in the world, Renzo Piano being one of the great architects of the world at the moment, come up with less than fantastic designs. This one was a proposal in central London, very close to one of our main railway stations, 72-storey high building in an area where the local plan said one tall building. They'd already given permission to that one tall building. Then this one came in. What was interesting here was what often happens with these schemes. The developer floats the idea, they suggest the idea before they put in the formal application. And there was such an outcry against this, including ourselves, who went public. We went to the newspapers and said that we thought this was a very damaging proposal because it would be visible from a very large part of West London, from some of the historic parks. We felt this would be inappropriate. Many other people said so. And the developers withdrew this particular scheme and came in with something that was very much lower, about a third or quarter of the height, which I understand has now been approved. We're not that happy with that one, but I have to say it's a lot better than this, which I think would cause, for all the elegance of the design, I think would cause visual intrusion in many places. So, just quickly, some lessons that I think we've learnt over the years. The City Council is central to our success, central to success, but it can only happen through cooperation with the politicians, the investors, local groups, residents, and all of those happen in different mixes. There's no one particular model that works. Second point I've made already, which is that even the most unlikely partnerships can come up with really positive results. And what that needs in the first place is a climate of mutual trust. Thirdly, image and perception are absolutely vital, and I think increasingly the role of media and social media are vital in getting people to think about what they care about, to say what they care about, and it allows organisations like us and City Council and the developers to hear the views of the community. There's no single way of achieving successful regeneration. I think you need all the actors on the stage to play their part. And I think there's no right scale to regeneration. You need the big projects, you need the small projects, and the ones in between. So a flexible model, you might say. As Philip said, the spaces around the buildings need improving as well. You can't just do the buildings alone. And simply restoring the buildings is not enough. If you don't tackle some of the underlying social and economic issues that have caused the buildings to become problem buildings, then you're probably wasting your money, or you're wasting some of your money. And as we've found in areas where the social and economic circumstances haven't really helped, maybe 10 years down the line, you're then investing more money again in the same building. So you need to think quite widely about how you achieve the regeneration. Don't expect things to happen straight away. It always seems to take longer than it should do, but eventually you hopefully reach a tipping point. And I think perhaps one of the most important things is involve the local community. In the old days, we tended to do regeneration, and we did it at people, and we thought this was the right way to do it. That doesn't really work well. You need to work with the community right from the very start. I've added another one to these 9, which is that people love water. And Liverpool, Bristol, London, other cities and towns around the country, I think giving people access to water, to walk up and down, to enjoy the space, the feeling of the wind on the sea, that sort of thing, is really important. It's attractive for tourists as well as for local community. So somehow trying to improve access to the waterfront, I think is really important. I just wanted to end with a few quick reflections on Valparaiso. Now, I first came here about 9 years ago as a tourist. I loved what I saw then, and I went away with lots of memories and a few works of art as well. And now coming back here nearly a decade on, I think I'm really positive. I'm really positive about what I've seen. I've seen significant change, expansion of the kind of vitality in the area, and I think it definitely feels to me like a world-class city, and I think people should be really proud of what they've managed to achieve so far. But I recognise that it's not just the bricks, the stones, the timber that makes a successful place. It's also about the people, and the people make the city. And anybody who's been to England knows in Liverpool, they have a very, very, very strong sense of personal identity. They identify so strongly with their city. And I get that sense here too, which is fantastic. So I'm feeling very positive about the changes. In the last few days, I've met lots of people who are different players in the regeneration picture here, and I'm feeling very positive. They all have a passion to improve the place, and I think that's a really good start. If you don't have that, you're never going to succeed. So I think, I recognise there are huge challenges, housing issues, economic issues. Heritage is not the most important thing in most people's lives. I don't think it should be, but I think it plays a really positive part, and I think hopefully demonstrated with the research that we've done is that heritage drives positive economic growth. And what our current government talks about is creating economic growth that delivers social and environmental improvements, good growth, as they call it. So, and in a world where globalization is creating cities that look more and more like each other, where it's difficult, you stand in the street and sometimes you can't remember which city you're in, places like Valparaiso have a really big advantage because they have such a distinctive landscape, a distinctive style, they have a way of going about things, they have an intellectual curiosity, a fascination for their past, but also a desire to create a new future. And I think that's a really positive feeling that I've picked up in the last few days here. So in many ways, I think you have all the tools that you need. You have the people, you have the historic fabric. Now, of course, it would be lovely to have more public money to do things, but in reality, for you as well as for us in the UK, public money will get smaller and smaller. There is not that much public money, and you can't solve heritage problems with public money alone. You need that mix of public and private, and you also need volunteers, people who care, who live in the city or care about the city, to come and do things. And walking around the city the last couple of days, I've seen people, met people who give up their time to protect the place that they care about. They have no financial stake in doing that, but they do that and play their part in creating that positive outcome. So I think what I've seen here is fascinating, and I think I feel really positive for the future of this place. And very much we would like to play our part in helping you in a very small way in thinking about how you might develop that and go forward. Muchas gracias.